Hey guys, in this video I'm going to review the Hori GameCube Controller, which was released exclusively in Japan in 2003 alongside the Game Boy Player, which was an add-on for the GameCube that allowed you to play the Game Boy line of games on the TV. And this controller is fairly expensive these days, so I'm sure there are many people who are curious as to whether this is worth it or not. So that's what I'm going to attempt to solve with this video. So let's continue. Alright, so before we look at that controller, let's take a look at the stock GameCube controller to get a better sense of why they deemed it necessary to make a controller specifically for the Game Boy Player. And to do that, let's look at my sweet Spice Orange GameCube controller. So yeah, taking a look at the left side of the controller, the default resting position of my thumb is on the analog stick, which isn't ideal for 2D games because, for those types of games, you want that digital input like a D-pad or something. And it's positioned right here, so you have to move your thumb if you want to play 2D games, so that's a little annoying. And yeah, just looking at my thumb here, you'll see that it covers the entire D-pad, which reveals how small the GameCube D-pad is. So yeah, based on the positioning of the D-pad and the size of it, you can really tell how de-emphasized the D-pad was in general on this controller, which, think about it now, Nintendo has kind of done that since the N64, where they de-emphasized the D-pad, and even on the Wii, and actually even on the Switch as well, with the Joy-Cons have, the D-pad is more of 4 individual buttons rather than this plus-shaped D-pad. Which is strange because Nintendo essentially invented the D-pad, back in the 80s, so it's interesting that they abandoned it fairly early on, relatively speaking, while the competition continues to emphasize the D-pad a little bit more. But anyway, yeah, that kind of poses a problem for 2D games on the GameCube. And looking at the middle of the controller, it has the start button, which is nice, but the Game Boy line has a start and select button, so it's missing a button there. And looking at the top of the controller, as you can see, the shoulder buttons are analog, which is nice for something like a racing game or Mario Sunshine, where depending on how hard you press the button, it'll impact how much water you shoot out of the flood pack, which is cool. But for something like a 2D game, you want that digital button press where it either registers as you pressing the button or no. It's a binary thing, 1 or 0. You don't want that much give on your button presses because it's less precise. So that's another issue there. But yeah, those are the 3 major things that make GameCube controllers less than ideal for 2D games. I think it's a good controller for 3D games, a very good controller, but you can tell 2D was not Nintendo's emphasis during those days. So yeah, that's why Hori kind of deemed it necessary to create a controller specifically for the Game Boy Player. Speaking of which, let's move on to that. All right, so getting into the controller itself. So of course it's made by Hori, which, as you may or may not know, they've pretty much been a top-tier accessory maker for at least a couple decades, probably longer than that. They usually make first-party quality stuff. They make arcade sticks, screen protectors, the N64 Hori Mini Controller, which I also reviewed, by the way, in case you're interested. So yeah, they've been around for a while, and they make excellent controllers and whatnot. So you're getting good stuff when you buy Hori. And this is also available in purple, which is actually the one I wish I got because the GameCube I got at launch and used for my Game Boy Player now is the Indigo model, so it's something I wish I had, but whatever. But anyway, yeah, looking at the controller, it'll instantly remind you of the Super Nintendo controller, based on the shape and kind of the positioning of the buttons. But yeah, let's take a look at each individual aspect of the controller. So, as I said, it's shaped like the Super Nintendo controller, which I would say is one of the 2 best controllers for 2D games alongside the Sega Saturn controller, so that's good. And as you can see, the D-pad's on the left side. It's more on the stiff side compared to something like the Saturn controller, which is pretty mushy, but it feels good overall, and it's pretty big, as you can see. There are no analog sticks, so there's no analog or C-stick, which is good. There's no extra, useless aspects of the controller, because why would you need analog sticks for a 2D gaming experience, so that's good. There is a select button on this, unlike the GameCube controller, the stock one anyway, and they're positioned in a similar way as a Super Nintendo controller. They're on an angle, and they have that kind of rubbery eraser feel to them, which is kind of a nice touch. The Z button is right here. It's kind of there just as an option button for if you're using the stock Game Boy Player software. I'll get to that later on why you should not be using the stock Game Boy Player software at the end of the video. But yeah, and the shoulder buttons, unlike the stock GameCube controller, they're digital, which is nice. They feel good and responsive. And all right, so this is probably one of the more controversial aspects to the controller. It has the stock GameCube, kind of puppy paw face button layout, which I think is great for the games that are on the GameCube. And I actually thought it was a pretty forward-thinking button layout for 3D games. But some people may not like this for 2D games, and they might just like the traditional diamond button layout of the Super Nintendo, or what pretty much all modern controllers use. It's another thing again where Nintendo created the diamond button layout and then abandoned it for many years, and then kind of brought it back with the Wii U and Switch. But Nintendo's pretty puzzling sometimes. They'll create things and then just abandon them next generation. But anyway, yeah. So the thing to remind yourself regarding this face button layout is you're not going to be using all 4 buttons, because you do have to remember the Game Boy line, including the Game Boy Advance, which people call a portable Super Nintendo, they only have 2 face buttons. So what you'll find is that you'll either be using the A and B buttons together, or the A and Y buttons, when you're playing Game Boy games. So you kind of have to ignore the fact that, it has this type of layout, because it's kind of irrelevant. And the A and B button combination, the A and Y combination, they're very comfortable. They're a lot better than you would think they are, and it's very kind of ergonomic, kind of the way they're placed. So I think the people who don't like the face button layout, I think that's kind of overstated a bit, how bad it is. I personally think it's a good layout. So yeah, no problems there. And one interesting thing about this controller that kind of separates it from the Super Nintendo one, ergonomics-wise, is that on the back of the controller, as you can see, it's not flat, and it has 2 grips on the side, which makes it a little more comfortable to hold, which is nice. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say in terms of kind of the button layout and the positioning of everything. Overall, it's a very comfortable controller to hold and play with. Pretty much no complaints. And of course, you can use this controller to play, the 2D games that were on the GameCube. There aren't all that many on the GameCube. I can think of maybe like 20 at the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, there's stuff like Ikaruga and whatnot. So it's useful for that. And also, kind of humorously, you can use this on the Switch as well, using the Wii U GameCube adapter. So that's kind of neat. Of course, you have to keep in mind that there's no home button on this controller, so you wouldn't be able to get back to the Switch main menu. But it is nice that's a feature, because there are a lot of 2D indie games on the system and a lot of just 2D games in general. So if for whatever reason you'd like to use this on the Switch, you can do that as well. Alright, so I hinted at this earlier, and it's kind of more of a PSA than anything else, because it's not directly related to this controller. But if you are buying this controller specifically for the Game Boy player and you want to play Game Boy games, I would recommend against the default Game Boy Player software that comes with the Game Boy Player. First of all, it's pretty expensive, and you can get Game Boy Players without the disc pretty cheaply, so I would do that if possible. But the thing about the stock software is that no one really reported about it at the time, but people kind of looked back on it in hindsight and saw that the experience isn't as accurate as it would be on a Game Boy Advance. There's some input lag. The picture quality isn't as good. Yeah, it's just not an optimal experience. Kind of the resolution is kind of weird in places. So what you want to use is homebrew software called Game Boy Interface. And I'm not going to explain how exactly to kind of add homebrew on GameCube, because this video isn't really about that. It's more about the controller itself. But if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask in the comments, and I'll kind of direct you in the right places. But yeah, the Game Boy interface, the picture quality is amazing. It's much more accurate. It's pretty much almost lag free. It's as close as you can get, pretty much, and it's the best way to play Game Boy games on your TV, in my opinion. Even better than the Super Game Boy 2, with the exception of a couple games. But yeah, I couldn't recommend the Game Boy interface enough to those who like the Game Boy line of games. Just wanted to point that out in case anyone was intent on using, or they had intent on using the stock software. I would not do that at all. Alright, so we've reached the end of the video, and of course the question is this controller worth buying? That's a very difficult question to answer. I haven't looked at the price of this thing. I got this about 10 years ago, probably a little less than that, and I bought it off someone from a forum, so I don't know. I'm guessing this one costs over $100. That's what I've been told. And for that price, I would recommend against it, because while it is kind of a luxury to have this thing for Game Boy games, it's not that essential, because for one, I would say the Game Boy library, including the Game Boy Advance, most of the games are not that D-pad intensive, and they're not that Twitch-based. They're kind of slower, I would say, in general. So, especially if you plan on playing RPGs like the Pokemon games primarily, it doesn't really matter how big or small the D-pad is. Like, for something like Mega Man Zero, like if you're a big Mega Man fan, then yeah, having a nice D-pad is more of an issue and more of a consideration, I would say. So it really depends on like which games you're interested in playing on the Game Boy player. And aside from that, there are cheaper alternatives out there. For example, one thing you could do is buy a Super Nintendo controller and a Super Nintendo to GameCube adapter. There's this website called RAFnet, and they make a lot of great adapters for various systems. So that's another option you can do, and it wouldn't be as expensive as getting this specific Hori GameCube controller. But yeah, like, independent of price, I would say this controller is really nice, and it is more of a luxury, I would say, when you are considering price. But overall, I do really enjoy using this controller, and it is primarily what I use when I play Game Boy games on my GameCube. But for the price, it's just I would say there are very few controllers that are worth over $100, especially when there are other options out there. But it is something to note, and it isn't an option for you, if you really do love playing Game Boy games and you want kind of the officially licensed controller to do so. But yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope it was informative, and if you're interested in getting it and have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them in the comments. And yeah, until then, take care.